I want to speak to you about something that quietly happens to many thoughtful people, something rarely acknowledged and often misunderstood. It is the slow, almost invisible drifting apart from others, not because of anger, not because of betrayal, but because of depth, because of thinking too much, or perhaps more accurately, thinking too honestly. Let me ask you something before we go further. Have you ever noticed that as you began to think more deeply about life, your circle of friends seemed to grow smaller? If this has happened to you, I invite you to share your experience in the comments below, not to complain, but to recognize a shared pattern. Now, here is a fact that few people like to admit. Most social relationships are built on shared assumptions, not shared inquiry. Friendship, as it commonly exists, is often a mutual agreement not to question certain things too deeply. We agree on what matters, what is normal, what is worth pursuing, and as long as those agreements hold, the bond feels comfortable. But the deep thinker is dangerous to comfort, not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably. Because the moment you begin to question the assumptions themselves, you disturb the invisible contract. You are no longer simply participating in the game. You are asking why the game exists at all. This is why deep thinkers often feel subtly out of place. They listen to conversations and sense the unspoken rules. Don't go there, don't question that, don't make it too real. And at first they try to adapt. They nod, they smile, they keep their deeper thoughts to themselves. But over time, this creates a quiet tension, because living half expressed is exhausting. Here is an argument worth considering. Many friendships are sustained by shared distractions. Sports, gossip, ambition, complaints, entertainment, these are not wrong, but they function as buffers against silence. The deep thinker, however, is less interested in buffers and more interested in truth. And truth has a way of dissolving small talk. As your thinking deepens, you may notice that conversations start to feel repetitive. The same concerns, the same fears, the same ambitions recycled again and again. This does not make others shallow, it makes them human. But it does create distance when your inner world is moving in a different direction. Another fact, depth slows you down. While others rush to conclusions, opinions, and identities, the deep thinker hesitates. They see complexity where others see certainty. And in a social world that values confidence over curiosity, hesitation is often misread as detachment or judgment. This is where misunderstandings begin. Friends may feel that you are no longer present, when in fact you are more present than ever, just not on the surface. You are listening beneath the words, feeling beneath the gestures, questioning beneath the laughter. And this kind of presence can be unsettling to those who are avoiding themselves. Let me be very clear about this. Deep thinkers do not lose friends because they are arrogant or superior. They lose friends because they are no longer pretending. And pretense, while socially useful, is fragile. There is also a subtle loneliness that comes with seeing through things. Once you notice how much of social life is performance, you cannot unsee it. Compliments feel rehearsed. Arguments feel predictable. Even rebellion begins to look like another costume. And when you speak from this awareness, others may not know how to respond. Here is a call to thought. When you speak honestly, do you notice people changing the subject, making a joke, or becoming uncomfortable? This is not rejection in the dramatic sense. It is avoidance. And avoidance is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. Deep thinkers often make others uneasy because they remind them of unanswered questions. Questions about meaning, mortality, identity, and freedom. Most people are not ready to face these questions. Not because they are incapable, but because they are busy surviving the roles they have accepted. As you change inwardly, relationships that were built on the old version of you may begin to weaken. This is not a tragedy, it is a natural consequence of growth, but it feels painful because we are taught to equate loss with failure. Let me offer you a different perspective. Losing friends is not always a sign that something is wrong with you. Sometimes it is a sign that you are no longer shrinking yourself to fit familiar patterns. If this resonates with you, do not rush to label yourself as broken or antisocial. Pause instead and ask, am I losing people or am I losing illusions? Now let us look at what happens inside the deep thinker when these distances begin to appear, because the outer loss of friends is often followed by an inner conflict. When people drift away, the thoughtful mind does not simply move on. It turns inward and asks, what did I do wrong? This question, while understandable, is often misplaced. Here is a crucial fact. Deep thinkers tend to assume responsibility for emotional shifts they did not cause. Because they reflect more, they blame themselves more. And so when friendships cool or fade, they search for a personal flaw rather than a structural mismatch. You may begin to wonder if you have become too intense, too quiet, too serious, too different. And in that questioning, you may attempt to correct yourself. You soften your words. You avoid certain topics. You laugh at things that no longer move you. This is not kindness. This is self-erasure. There is an argument here that deserves attention. Belonging that requires you to betray your own clarity is not belonging at all. It is a contract based on silence, and silence, when forced, eventually becomes resentment. Deep thinkers often feel guilty for changing, but change is not something you chose. It is something that happened as a result of attention. When you pay attention long enough, you cannot remain the same. To ask yourself to stop changing for the sake of comfort is to ask water not to flow. Another reason deep thinkers lose friends is that they stop reacting automatically. Many social bonds are reinforced through shared emotional reactions, outrage, excitement, fear, enthusiasm. The deep thinker begins to notice these patterns and pauses, and that pause is often misinterpreted as indifference. But indifference is not what is happening. What is happening is awareness, and awareness does not rush. It observes, it listens, it waits. Unfortunately, in fast-moving social environments, waiting can feel like withdrawal. Here is a direct call to thought. When you stopped reacting the way you used to, who benefited from that reaction, and who felt threatened when it disappeared? You see, reactions are predictable. They make us feel safe. When someone stops reacting on cue, the unspoken script breaks, and people who rely on that script may feel uncomfortable, even exposed. Deep thinkers also tend to lose friends because they no longer fear being misunderstood. At some point, you realize that being liked for a false version of yourself is far lonelier than being alone. This realization is subtle, but once it arrives, it cannot be undone. There is also the matter of timing. Deep thinkers often move inward while others are moving outward. They are questioning meaning while others are building identity. They are dissolving certainty while others are collecting it. These movements are not wrong. They are simply out of sync. When rhythms differ, distance grows naturally. This does not mean one rhythm is superior. It means they no longer align, and forcing alignment only creates strain. Another uncomfortable truth is this. Deep thinkers remind others of impermanence. By questioning goals, values, and assumptions, they indirectly point to the fragility of the structures people depend on. And most people, quite understandably, resist that reminder. So friends may drift not because they dislike you, but because you disturb their sense of stability. This is not something you can fix without betraying yourself. If you are listening to this and feeling a mixture of relief and sadness, that is natural. Relief because something finally makes sense. Sadness because clarity often comes with loss. But do not conclude too quickly. Loss is not the end of connection. It is often the clearing of space. Now let us speak about what comes after the distance, because this is where many deep thinkers misunderstand their own journey. When old friendships fall away, there is often a frightening silence, and the mind is quick to label that silence as failure. But silence is not emptiness. Silence is space, and space is where something new can finally appear. Here is a fact rarely acknowledged. Deep thinkers do not end up with no friends. They end up with fewer illusions. And once those illusions dissolve, what remains is the possibility of real connection, connection that does not depend on performance, agreement, or emotional convenience. At first, this feels uncomfortable. You may find yourself spending more time alone than you ever have before, and the question arises, is something wrong with me? But I invite you to ask a different question instead. What if this solitude is not a punishment, but a recalibration? Solitude, when chosen consciously, is not loneliness. It is an environment in which clarity stabilizes. It allows your thoughts to settle, not into rigid conclusions, but into understanding. And from that understanding, you begin to recognize others who are not afraid of depth. These connections do not announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, sometimes through a single conversation that feels unusually honest, sometimes through shared silence that feels unusually alive. And when these connections form, they do not require maintenance through constant reassurance. They breathe on their own. Here is an argument worth holding on to. One authentic connection can nourish you more deeply than a dozen shallow ones. This is not because depth is superior, but because it is sustainable. You are no longer fragmenting yourself to fit multiple expectations. Deep thinkers often discover that their new relationships are slower, fewer, and more spacious. There is less urgency to define, label, or possess. There is room for disagreement without threat. There is curiosity instead of defense. And most importantly, there is permission to change. This is where solitude becomes strength. When you are comfortable being alone, you no longer approach others from need. You approach them from sharing. You are not asking to be completed. You are offering presence. Ask yourself this honestly. How different would your relationships feel if you were not trying to secure them, impress them, or protect them from your real thoughts? When you stop trying to be understood by everyone, you become understandable to the right people. This is not strategy, it is consequence. Authenticity filters naturally. There is also a deeper freedom that emerges here. You begin to realize that friendship is not ownership. People come and go, not because love fails, but because life moves. When you stop clinging to permanence, you stop interpreting change as rejection. This does not make you cold, it makes you gentle. You appreciate people while they are present, without demanding they remain forever. And paradoxically, this makes the connection richer, not weaker. Let me be very clear. Thinking deeply does not mean withdrawing from life. It means engaging with it without illusion. It means loving people without needing them to validate your worldview. It means listening without immediately correcting. It means speaking honestly without forcing agreement. If you are a deep thinker and you have lost friends, do not rush to rebuild what no longer fits. Let the space teach you. Let it refine your attention. Let it show you that connection is not measured by numbers, but by resonance. And here is the final thought I want to leave you with. You did not lose friends because you became difficult. You became quieter because you became clearer. And clarity is lonely only when you believe it must be crowded to be real. If this resonated with you, sit with it for a moment. You do not need to explain yourself to anyone. The right connections will recognize you without effort. And until then, your own company is not a failure, it is a foundation.